Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Okay, yeah. How is everybody doing today?
Good.
Good. Glad to hear it. I'm Pastor McCarthy from St. Paul's in Ashland. I am new to the Ohio district. I had no idea what OWL was. I'm meeting Pastor Cromwick. He kind of signed me up for it. So we're gonna do a paper that I wrote for something else and see what you think of it and those sorts of things. But I was in South Dakota for 8.5 years. Just came here in March hit the ground running. So I've been ordained for about 9 years now. I have a wife and 2 little kids. They're 3 and 1. One will be 4 soon. And they're down in Kentucky. We've lost power today, so they're staying out of the house. They're trying to run around and use the car's air conditioning and those sorts of things. So, it's always an interesting time if you are around the McCarthy household. And my wife is learning that. We haven't been married that long, so she's learning that every day. So I have a paper here. I'm mostly going to read it on the royal favor communicated through the Lord's Supper to you. There's a couple of things that I wanted to start with, though, that are not, and then I'll get to reading the paper. Really, I'm just testing how strong they make the coffee here. Putting myself at the end of the day and then just reading to you. But there's a couple of things that I do want to start out with. I did write this paper for a class with this very specific kind of set of readings and point to it. And the point that the professor wanted to impress upon us is, well, who is remembering who when Jesus says, "Do this in remembrance of me"? Okay, so usually, at least how I thought, Jesus is telling us to remember him as we eat and drink his body and blood, right? But the Greek is a little bit, and even in English you can do this, you just maybe don't know that you can do this. Not usually the way that we talk. The Greek is a little bit more ambiguous, so it could be, it's Jesus's remembering, or it could be Jesus remembering something else, Jesus remembering you, or the Father remembering Jesus. It could be kind of a couple of different options there. And as you look at it more and more, one of the people that I'm kind of interacting with here is actually a Methodist pastor, and his contention is that Jesus is asking the Father to remember him through this meal that his disciples celebrate. I don't think he's quite getting to the point, but he is at least making us think a little bit more about to do this in remembrance of me. So that is kind of the first point that I'm interacting with. His name is Jeremias or Jeremias. I think he's German. The second one is this idea that in the person of Christ, God suffers. And in his suffering, it is suffering itself that is suffering, okay? Because he is still God, who is impassible, and yet he suffers and defeats death by his death, right? So those are kind of a couple of things. Now, when I say that you can do this in English, you just maybe don't think this way. It's whatever. You can say that you can translate Jesus's words there. Do this in my remembrance, right? Do this in remembrance of me. Do this in my remembrance. It would be the same thing. It's a case, a genitive case, and it's usually possessive. So, who is Jesus remembering, or are we remembering him in this meal? Is that the primary thing that's happening? Okay. Does everybody understand what I'm saying, what I'm interacting with here? Yeah, and like I said, Jeremias, I'll probably say Jeremias, is saying that Jesus is instituting this meal kind of in the context of the first century Palestine as a remembrance meal for the Father to remember him, which would be playing a lot on his human nature. Right? right? That God would remember this man. Okay, so I'll start reading and testing the coffee here. If you have any questions, just let me know. I don't get too flustered by somebody just saying, hey, I've got a question about that. Okay, in his book, The Eucharistic Words of Jesus, Jeremias argues that the Lord's Supper, Jesus' final meal with his disciples, should not be seen as an isolated event. Rather, he argues, this final supper should be seen as the culmination of all the table fellowship that Jesus had exhibited throughout his earthly ministry. One of our own professors, Dr. Just, would argue the same thing, and in fact he does in his commentary. Moreover, he explains, for the Oriental, it's written a little earlier, every table fellowship is a guarantee of peace, of trust, of brotherhood. Jeremias' approach to understanding the Lord's Supper in the context of the Palestinian milieu is certainly helpful. One can surmise from his work how the first century Jew, and especially the Pharisees, understood Jesus' table fellowship with sinners. Yet, while Jeremias emphasizes the human nature of the incarnate God, he does not do so with his divine nature. Jeremias does portray Jesus as a Messiah figure, and that the meal which he institutes is a messianic meal, but this does not completely explain the objection of the Pharisees to Jesus' meal practices. Rather, this objection comes to the fore at Jesus' trial when the council asked Jesus, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" To which the Lord replies, "I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." At this testimony of Jesus, the council rendered their verdict, "This man deserves death." But this is not a surprising condemnation from the council. It's the culmination of all their opposition to Jesus' life and ministry. The Pharisees and scribes object to him because he receives sinners and eats with them. As a rebuke, Jesus unveils heavenly mysteries. He heals a man on the Sabbath and claims to be the Lord of the Sabbath. So two things must always be together: Jesus' claims to divinity and his divine favor showed towards the unworthy. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. As God in human flesh, descended from the line of David, Jesus is the true King of Israel at his birth. He reigns over the nations, over creation, and even over the demons who, though rebellious, must obey the King. The inscription which hung over his head on the cross read, "This is the King of the Jews." And after his resurrection, Jesus declares, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me." He remains the King, even in his suffering and death. Now, more than this, it is in his suffering and death that the King gains victory. By his body given over into death and his blood shed for the forgiveness of sins, the wicked ruler of this world is cast out. It is this victory which he gives in the Lord's Supper to the men and women gathered around his table. It is a royal victory feast by which he remembers his people and presses them on to the heavenly banquet. The victory has been won by the King, and he gives the spoil of his victory to his people. Now, it is therefore the contention of this paper that the Lord's Supper should be understood as communication of royal favor from the King of Kings to the people of his kingdom. To arrive at this conclusion, we'll first give brief attention to the word favor, chen in Hebrew, charis in Greek, especially as these words are used in the Old Testament. Next, briefly again, will be a consideration of the person of Christ. It is his remembrance meal, and one needs to give attention to the host of any meal. Finally, we will consider the suffering of God in an attempt to understand what kind of meal this is, whether one should joyfully receive it often or refrain and discipline ourselves against eating it too often. Okay, so the Hebrew word for favor is chen. We have a name that we use all the time, right? Hannah means gracious, favored one, right? And charis is the Greek word for the same thing. I think people are naming their babies that more and more often, especially girls. But those are the two words that we're going to be looking at in the Old Testament. Of course, the Old Testament's written in Hebrew, but then it was translated into Greek before our Lord was born into human flesh. So it is worthwhile to look at that and see how these things were understood in that time. So usage of chen in the Old Testament. A quick word search for chen will find that this word is used 70 times in the Old Testament. This word appears all over the books of the Old Testament, from the Torah, throughout the prophets, and even in the wisdom literature. It is not an uncommon word, often used in this or a similar construction: if I have found favor in your eyes. Searching the Old Testament, one will find that the usage of this word chen can vary, but only a little. In some cases, it is used as an adjective, meaning graceful, which can be descriptive of an inanimate object or a person. In other usages, especially in Proverbs, chen is an object itself which adorns the neck. In one case, chen is translated as a magic stone when referring to a bribe or a gift. If you wanted to look at that, that's Proverbs 17, verse 8. I don't know if he's advising you to do that in that case. But most commonly, chen is used in the manner of disposition. It's a relational word, and this in two dimensions. First, between two people. And this is always between ranks of people, usually when an inferior person makes a request to a superior. One example would be in Esther, wherein Esther requests that the king of Babylon halt Haman's murderous plot against the Jews. His favor toward her demands action. The king grants Esther's request and halts Haman's plans. But the other dimension of favor is between man and God. And while this dimension shares some of the characteristics of the human dimension, men make requests to God, there is another characteristic to this dimension that is not present in the human dimension, and that is the divine presence. A good example of this is Exodus 34, verse 9. And Moses said, "If I have now found favor in your sight, O Lord, please let the Lord go in the midst of us, for it is a stiff-necked people, and pardon our iniquity and our sin, and take us for your inheritance." While retaining some of the elements of human favor, Moses is making a request. The request is for God's presence among his people, to pardon their iniquity and to be their God, and they his people. Now, of particular importance for the purposes of this paper are two examples that combine the ideas of favor, request, divine presence, and eating. Genesis 18, the visit of the three men to Abraham, and 1 Samuel 1, Hannah's prayer in the temple. In the Genesis 18 account, favor functions really in a typical way. "O Lord, if I have found favor in your sight, do not pass by your servant." Abraham is making a request as a humble servant to a master. One could argue when it was that Abraham recognizes that these visitors are God and his angels, but that is not the point to recognize here. Rather, it is that the scriptural account explicitly states that the Lord appeared to Abraham, and that favor was shown to Abraham by his divine presence. He does not pass by, but stays and eats, Abraham serving as host and the Lord his guest. Now, the account of 1 Samuel 1 is a little different, and in keeping with other scriptural accounts of men eating in the Lord's presence. Example would be Exodus 24, Moses and the 70 elders up on Mount Sinai. In 1 Samuel 1, Hannah, whose name means grace or favor, is portrayed as one whom her husband favors by the double portion of the sacrifice food that he gives her. And yet she does not understand herself as favored by the Lord, who had closed her womb. Though she is favored by her husband, she is not favored by the Lord, causing distress so that she would not eat. Seeking the Lord's favor, she ventures to the temple where, after praying, Eli the priest grants her a promise, and she replies, "Let your servant find favor in your sight." And she goes her way and eats and drinks. Now, though a modern understanding of this text may explain this fasting and eating as symptoms of depression, the connection between the favor of the Lord, his divine presence, and eating and drinking as a pattern in the scriptures cannot be ignored. While Jeremias' work on the table fellowship of Jesus is certainly helpful to understanding the Lord's Supper, a study of the word "hain" or favor in the Old Testament can reveal another dimension and pattern of the Lord's working among his people. In the very least, his favor, his presence, and eating and drinking are connected in some way. I would argue that his favor is his presence, and this is never absent of eating and drinking with him. Jesus himself speaks this way. I tell you, many will come from east and west and recline at table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, while the sons of the kingdom will be thrown into outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now moving on then to the person of Christ. In the person of Christ, the human and divine dimensions of Cain are united. As stated above, the human dimension of Cain actuates in asking for favor from the inferior to the superior. The divine dimension is that God's favor is his presence at the meal. In the Lord's Supper, both are happening. The supplicants come to the table asking for favor, the forgiveness of their sins, and the host not only grants the request, but is himself present in the eating and drinking. And yet, who is he to grant such a request? Now, the answer in the prophets and the Gospels is clear. Because he is God in human flesh, he is the rightful king of Israel. He is the king whom Isaiah saw. He is born in David's city. He is called the one born king of the Jews, and repeatedly throughout his ministry he is called the son of David, the king of Israel. The people wish to make him king by force. Christ confirms his kingship before Pilate, and it is precisely in his atoning death for the sins of the people that the sign hangs above his head, "This is the King of the Jews." It is not at all contrary to his kingship that Jesus is crucified. It is precisely in his suffering and death, as Streltsov shows, that this king conquers suffering and death for his people. As he promised, "Take heart, I have overcome the world." And while it may seem strange to say that the King of the Jews gains the victory in his death, Alexei Streltsov in his article, Theopaskism as Love, that's suffering and death are overcome by the suffering and death of the Son of God, and he's a Russian Lutheran, illustrates this tremendous truth. Men of all times, as he explains, have tried to understand the suffering of Christ in three major ways. First is to say that God cannot suffer. Suffering is proper to man. And thus, when Christ suffered, his humanity suffered, but God did not suffer in his passion. This is the simple classical view of the impassible God. A more modern approach is to say that Christ suffered because God is love, and it is in the nature of love to suffer. Thus, suffering would be located eternally in the nature of the triune God himself, and would have no end. But Streltsov proposes a third view in accord with Cyril of Alexandria, that in Christ the impassible God suffered on the cross of Calvary, but that by his suffering he did not become passible. In the cross, suffering did not become characteristic of his divine nature. Instead, suffering itself was overcome and swallowed up by God in the flesh. Now, if one were to take this view, which would be wise, according to me, right? However wise you think I am, then we could see why the gospel writers make a point to say that this is the King of the Jews. Not simply because Christ was rejected by his people, that they wanted an earthly king and not a heavenly one. That's true. But it must be understood in the context of the entire divine revelation. In the context of the entire biblical revelation, we see that this promised King of the Jews establishes a kingdom precisely for the world in the Father's sacrifice of the Son, in the atonement rendered by the Son before the Father for the sake of the world. In this suffering, the love of God for the world overcomes the sin of the world. Suffering suffers him, death dies at his death, and victory is gained by the King of Israel. In the encounter between the impassible God and the Passion, it is God who gains victory. All right, well, we are getting really late in the day, I know, and reading to you, but so what does it all have to do with the Lord's Supper? In the words of Jeremias, this meal of Jesus with his disciples must not be isolated, but should rather be seen as one of a long series of daily meals they had shared together. But as we have seen throughout the scriptures, neither is this isolated to the first century. This table fellowship with God extends back in time to Abraham through Hannah, and forward in time to the reclining at table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. Again, Jeremias, speaking of the connection between the Passover and the Last Supper, notes, at this festival, the people of God remember the merciful immunity granted to the houses marked with the blood of the Paschal Lamb and the deliverance from Egyptian servitude. But that is only one aspect. At the same time, the Passover is a looking forward to the coming deliverance, of which the deliverance from Egypt is the prototype. That's what Jeremias is saying. That deliverance has come in the sacrifice of the Son of God on the cross. Jesus' institution of his memorial meal as the substance of the shadow that is the Passover meal makes this clear. Jesus does not command the Passover meal to be kept by his disciples any longer, but to celebrate his supper. For now they are participating in the victory of God of old and the favor that he showed to them in the land of Egypt, but rather they are participating in the victory in his suffering and death for the sins of the world, and the favor he has shown to him there. Furthermore, his divine presence will remain with them in this meal, so that all who eat and drink this bread and wine eat and drink his own body and blood, the same body and blood given and poured out for them before the Father, the same body and blood which gained victory by suffering and death. And he grants to you there the spoils of his royal victory, the forgiveness of your sins. Now, in closing this overly long and broad excursus, I didn't write it for today, but I know it is. It's still today. Right? Two psalms come to mind. The first is the familiar Psalm 23, which brings all of these themes together in the simple words of confession. He prepares a table before me in the presence of my enemies. See, is this some abstract, poetic thought, or can the Christian attribute this to the Lord's Supper? It would seem that the psalmist is giving words to the wonderful mystery of the Lord's Supper, that in the midst of sin and death, the King proclaims his royal victory over sin and death to men who are undeserving of a place at this table. This would have to be royal and divine favor, for men have no rightful claim, no bargaining trinket to buy this. And finally, then, the Christological Psalm 110, rule in the midst of your enemies. Luther gives a particularly comforting exposition of this verse. But here we are being given comfort and help against this, the suffering at the hands of the devil. Even though we must suffer scratches, bites, and stabs within and without, we are to believe with certainty that this king will continue to rule triumphantly against all these enemies, the devil, sin, death, and the world. Sin, which frightens and terrifies them, will not damn them, and death will have no power over them. In this Lord they have forgiveness of sins and redemption from death. This means they will have eternal righteousness, life, and joy. For this purpose he gave and sent out this scepter, the word of the gospel. He maintains his scepter because he wants to support and defend Christians in their sufferings, frailties, struggles, and anxieties. And in the end, he will redeem them. So then, in the midst of sin, death, and devil, under the assaults of the world and fissures within, the King of Kings declares his victory over them, for he still proclaims his death. Still he gives the spoils of his death, and still he grants royal favor to the undeserving and the weak at the supper which he bids Christians to eat and drink. Indeed, in the midst of our enemies, our cup overflows. Okay, I haven't checked the time, I'm afraid to. That is the end of the paper there. Does anybody have questions or things that you would like for me to expand on, or you didn't understand, anything like that? Yes?
What time frame is Jeremias?
Jeremias is in the 60s.
1960s.
Yeah. I believe he's dead now.
Did you say he was a Methodist?
He was a Methodist, yeah.
So when he, and I might not be remembering what you read correctly, but when he said this was not the only meal, he had many fellowship meals with the disciples,
Yeah.
did he say anything about the words of institution, making that, the last meal unique? I mean,
Unique, yeah. He did. His book is The Eucharistic Words of Jesus. So I really only highlighted his points of saying it's in continuity in order to say this is in continuity with the whole Revelation. But he does have things to say about that, and mostly it is that Jesus is establishing this meal in a Palestinian way from the first century, that God would remember what he does for his people. So it's more of a human dimension rather than a divine. He's emphasizing the human nature, just as some other people might do in that first century.
so do you know if he then considered this is literally?
No, I don't think he did.
Okay.
I think he would deny the real presence. Yeah, and again, it's because really what it comes down to is a Christological heresy, right? Nestorianism, whatever. Yeah. And,
I have a question about something you said with Hannah, and you talked about God's presence being like his favor.
yeah,
Right? Like those two ideas
are connected. Yeah.
So talking about the real presence then, like we have grace and favor in the sacrament of the altar,
Mhm.
because God is present truly
Yeah.
there. But how would that interact with like the concept of those who eat and drink to their own judgment? Because, you know,
Yeah.
the receptionist might say, well, they who do not have faith do not receive the true presence of God. But
Mhm.
the actual problem there is that they do receive the body and blood of God, and but not his favor, but rather they
Yeah.
eat and drink to their judgment who do not discern the body.
Right.
That's kind of a rambling question, I'm sorry. But
No, but it was something I didn't consider for this, because I was mostly doing it from a faithful perspective. What are the faithful receiving there? But his presence would be there for sure, and it would definitely be in judgment. So then he does stay with Abraham and eats and drinks with him, and then goes down to Sodom to see if this is really happening, you know. So he does visit in judgment, even as he visits Pharaoh in judgment. In answering maybe or elaborating on my point there, it would have to be according to what he said, either promise promise of grace or promise of judgment.
Got it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Could you, maybe I missed this at the very beginning, but could you elaborate on the do this in remembrance of me part that you talked about at the beginning? It seemed like there were a few possible interpretations of that. I've
Yeah.
always understood it to be that Jesus was instructing his disciples to, he was asking the disciples to do it in remembrance of him. But it sounds like there's maybe some other
Yeah, there's some other options.
possibilities.
Yeah, there's some other options, because what makes the Lord's Supper unique or necessary? If this is just for the disciples to remember his suffering and death, you can do that with the preaching of the gospel itself. So there's a couple of options. It can be, you certainly can and you should remember the suffering and death of Christ as you come to the table. I'm not negating that at all. And that is a possibility. But the other possibility is that it is Jesus' remembering of his people. So that is him remembering his people who are eating there. Yeah. So one of the ways, one of the images that might help is think of like a memorial gift, right? This is his memorial gift to his church, and you receive the benefits of it. that's kind of more of the idea that would make it more like a unique or necessary thing.
Or I guess if it is a like new institution taking the place of the Passover, like the Passover, they didn't just think of it as like, oh, we're doing this and just like recalling what happened way back then. They actually thought that they were like continuing the whole thing, that they were participating in
Yeah.
the original Passover even.
Yeah, yeah, yep. That's still so the other problem, if you kind of we're all Lutherans, right? We're all trained pretty well to kind of stay within the balance. But if you were to exclusively understand it, coming to the Lord's Supper as you're remembering, then you're it is you doing the thing. That's no longer a gift or grace. That is you working something. So this comes up already in the Reformation with Karlstadt, who makes a big point of saying that we are to rigorously remember Christ as we come to the table, and that is your preparation to do that. It turns into work. So, yeah.
Just maybe a comment on that. I mean, I guess to me, the Passover was instituted prior to the actual passing over of the firstborn.
Mm-hmm.
So the blood on the doorpost served to be a memorial to God to pass over the firstborns in the household.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Jesus he talks at the Transfiguration about the Exodus that he's about to accomplish. So this is also prior to that, and I know, I mean, going back to some of the Hebrew talks about this being a memorial, it may be a memorial that the Father sees the Son and remembers to act to save him from death. So to me, if you come to the Lord's Supper, you are also participating in the remembrance and the prayer that we eat the living, immortal blood of God, or drink the living, immortal blood of God, that God will remember to raise us up on the last day.
Yeah, that's a good point. And Luther is kind of along those lines, where he is. Luther's understanding of it is that when you're coming to the table and you are actually eating and drinking Christ's body and blood and becoming one flesh with him, what is happening again to that point that you are participating, Luther would say that Christ is carrying you now to the Father by his sacrifice. Yeah.
Is it connected at all to, like, I think of the big times where God remembers, is like Noah. God remembered Noah. Yeah. Is that kind of this other understanding of do this in my remembrance?
Yeah.
That kind of same thing?
Yeah, kind of same thing. Yeah.
In that same thread, I also have the understanding that when God remembers, he always acts.
He always acts.
It's always an action.
Exodus 2, right? He remembered his promise and he knew, and then he calls Moses, right? Yep, that's absolutely right. So his remembering and his knowing and his kind of willing something to do is never stagnant. There's no time between his knowing and thinking and planning and willing and his doing. There's no space there. Yeah, very good.
Thank you.
Okay. Oh yeah, thank you. I kind of, like I said, I just got here, right? And I don't know anybody, but I met Pastor Homewick back in May. He said, "Hey, we got this thing called OWL. Would you be interested in that?" I'm like, "Yeah, sure." And apparently I signed up there. That's all it took. So I had to get something together.
Thank you.
Yeah.